Now, I don't think it happens that often when you have an event with a famous writer, and the writer says, "Would it be okay if I did the event with my dad?" And if that did happen, you'd probably say, that's probably not a super great idea. We're probably not going to want to do that. But we like Joe so much that we wanted to indulge him and keep him happy so he'll keep doing book events with us. So we decided to do him a solid and said he could bring his dad, but just this once, because we don't want authors all the time getting the idea that every time they do an event at the bookstore, they can just bring their parents along to help them out. Now, Joe Hill is a writer's writer. By the way, Joe Hill really is his name. It's not his complete name, but it really is his name. And he is named after Joe Hill, the famous labor activist. But I digress. He has received the Ray Bradbury Fellowship, the William Crawford Award for Best New Fantasy Work back in 2006, a year in which he also won the World Fantasy Award for Best Novella. His first book won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Fiction Collection, as well as the British Fantasy Award. And both of those awards he won again in 2007 for Strange Weather. His novel Nosferatu was made into a comic book series and a TV show, and his fabulous 2016 novel, The Fireman, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Now, I was doing my research on Wikipedia, and I came across the following sentence, quote, talking about Fireman. It entered the New York Times bestseller list at #1, ahead of #2, the second highest ranked novel. Like, in case you don't understand the concepts of #1 and #2, they spelled it out for you. Along the way, he also had time to publish a comic book series, and recently it was announced that he would oversee and co-write a new horror line, Hill House Comics. I read a wonderful interview with Joe where he was describing why he started to write as a young teenager. And he talked about coming home from school, and both his parents, who are both famous writers, were in their offices writing. And so Joe said, quote, I thought you were meant to sit by yourself in a room and make up a bunch of stuff, and then one day someone would pay you for it. Well, obviously that worked for Joe better than it worked for me, because I've been sitting in my office making shit up for years and I still haven't gotten paid for it. But then again, I'm not Joe Hill. And Joe's dad is no slouch either. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he is the preeminent horror writer, not just of our time, but probably of all time. Bustle did a story about Stephen King's 10 scariest novels, and the title of the piece was Because Sleeping is Overrated. So 1 week ago tonight in Providence, we had the annual dinner of the New England Independent Booksellers Association, and Laura Cummings, the president of the association, gets to give out the President's Award, which is sort of like a lifetime achievement award for a New England author. And she chose to give it to this obscure novelist from Maine. Spoiler alert, Stephen King. And Stephen wasn't able to be here, I think because he was nervous and practicing for tonight. And so Laura gave a wonderful presentation speech, which was probably 10 hilarious minutes long, but the essence of which I could summarize by just saying that she, like most people, has had Stephen King scare the shit out of her entire reading life. For those of us like Laura, who are otherwise normal people, except that we've gone through life being terrified of woods and twins and cornfields, and especially clowns, well, you know who to thank for that. Or why no sane person opening a hotel in America would ever call it the Overlook Hotel. Or why the whole state of Maine is kind of scary in a sort of a peripheral way. Or why, even though James Joyce and Laurel and Hardy and The Bridge Over the River Kwai all featured the phrase, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, there is only one Jack that any of us ever thinks of when we hear that phrase. So I was thinking about what could I say to introduce a man who literally, and unlike is cliched normally said about writers, who literally needs no introduction. I reflected about why it is that there are a whole lot of writers out there who can write scary stuff, but there's only one Stephen King. And I came up with this. This is my own theory. The essence of horror is that it subverts the comfort and the safety of what is supposedly normal. Horrible things don't just happen in horror stories. They happen in war stories. They happen in thrillers. They happen in Game of Thrones. But they happen in situations that are supposed to be dangerous and scary. And so it doesn't turn us inside out when something dangerous and scary happens. But Stephen is such a master at taking things that we think of as ordinary and non-threatening and putting into them people and actions that completely undermine all our expectations of normalcy and safety and predictability. The genius of his imagination is the brilliant and creative juxtaposition of the reassuringly normal with the unexpectedly abnormal. And he's done that 61 times before, and he did it a 62nd time with the Institute. And if we're very, very lucky, he'll keep doing it many, many, many more times for years and books to come. Please join me in welcoming Joe and Steve.
Hey guys, thanks so much for coming out tonight.
Hey, Joe.
I want to thank the Somerville Theater and Porter Square Books for having us. This is great. You know, it's a once in a lifetime experience for me. I've never done this with Dad before.
It's a great really thing cool. For me too.
So I'm going to read a bit from my dad's new book, The Institute, to kick things off. You know, the first time I ever did a public reading was for my first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, which came out in 2007. And I wound up doing a reading in front of a hometown crowd at Water Street Books in Exeter, New Hampshire. Yeah. And I was scared shitless, you know, because I had never been out there in front of, like, there were 120 people, and I'd never been out there in front of a big crowd. I didn't have a lot of experience with public speaking. So I was pretty nervous, you know, shaky, and my mouth was dry. And that book is the story of a heavy metal musician who has a collection of grotesque artifacts. He's got like a tray-pan human skull and a witch's confession and a snuff film. And he hears about a woman selling a ghost online and decides he wants it. And if you've ever seen even like a single horror film, you know what a terrible idea that is. But he does it anyway, and then spends the next 300 pages regretting it. But in any event, so at the beginning of the story, he's in a relationship with this young woman. They've been together for a while, and the relationship is on the rocks. And the language is pretty salty, but it was an 8 in the evening reading. And I took a look at the crowd, and it pretty much looked like it was all grown-ups. And I thought, hell, I'm just going to read it the way I wrote it. So they're talking, they're in conversation, Jude and his girlfriend, Georgia, you know, and she says, "You're a sympathetic son of a bitch, you know that?" And he says, "You want sympathy? Go fuck James Taylor." And the moment after I said it, like 8 little kids popped up in the audience. Like middle schoolers, all of them. And the kids were like, and their parents were like. But after that, I decided to just let my freak flag fly. The moral of this story is if you brought small children to this event, we can't be on the hook for your bad parenting. So my dad's new novel is called The Institute. It's an absolute fucking blast. My wife and I have been reading it to each other. And in this particular evening, we're 15 pages from the ending. So I regret to inform you I won't be able to complete this reading. I'm going to go backstage and finish. Thank you. Good night. No, I'm going to read a portion from the middle. There's a place called The Institute in the deep woods of Maine. A number of children are being held there for sinister reasons, and one of them, a boy named Luke, has just managed to effect his escape by wriggling under a chain link fence, but he's not safe yet because he's got a tracking device embedded in his ear. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from the middle. He was out. Luke swayed to his knees and cast a wild look back, sure he'd see all the lights coming on, not just in the lounge, but in the hallways and the cafeteria, and in their glow he would see running figures, caretakers with their zap sticks unholstered and turned up to maximum power. There was no one. He got to his feet and began to run blindly, the vital next step, orientation, forgotten in his panic. He might have run into the woods and become lost there before reason reasserted itself, except for the sudden scorching pain in his left heel as he came down on a sharp rock and realized he had lost one of his sneakers in that final desperate lunge. Luke returned to the fence, bent, retrieved it, and put it on. His back and buttocks only smarted, but that final cut into his calf had been deeper and burned like a hot wire. His heartbeat slowed, and clear thinking returned. Once you're out, go level with the trampoline, Avery had said, relaying the second of Maureen's steps. Put your back to it, then turn right one medium-sized step. That's your direction. You only have a mile or so to go, and you don't need to keep in a perfectly straight line. What you're aiming for is pretty big, but try your best. Later, in bed that night, Avery had said that maybe Luke could use the stars to guide him. He didn't know about that stuff himself. All right then, time to go. But there was one other thing he had to do first. He reached up to his right ear and felt the small circle embedded there. He remembered someone, maybe Iris, maybe Helen, saying the implant hadn't hurt her because her ears were already pierced. Only pierced earrings unscrewed. Luke had seen his mother do it. This one was fixed in place. Please, God, don't let me have to use the knife. Luke steeled himself, worked his nails under the curved upper edge of the tracker, and pulled. His earlobe stretched and it hurt plenty, but the tracker remained fixed. He let go, took 2 deep breaths, memories of the immersion tank recurring as he did so, and pulled again, harder. The pain was worse this time, but the tracker remained in place and time was passing. The West Residence Wing, looking strange from this unfamiliar angle, was still dark and quiet. But for how long? He thought about pulling again, but that would only be postponing the inevitable. Maureen had known. It was why she left him the paring knife. He took it from his pocket, being careful not to pull out the thumb drive as well, and held it in front of his eyes in the scant starlight. He felt for the sharp edge with the ball of his thumb, then reached across his body with his left hand and pulled down on his earlobe, stretching it as far as it would go, which was not very. He hesitated, taking a moment to let himself really understand he was on the free side of the fence. The owl hooted again, a sleepy sound. He could see fireflies stitching the dark, and even in this moment of extremity realized they were beautiful. Do it fast, he told himself. Pretend you're slicing a piece of steak, and don't scream no matter how much it hurts. You cannot scream. Luke put the top of the blade against the top of his earlobe on the outside and stood that way for a few seconds that felt like a few eternities. Then he lowered the knife. I can't. You must. I can't. Oh, God, I have to. He placed the edge of the knife against that tender, unarmored flesh again and pulled down at once before he had time to do more than pray for the edge to be sharp enough to do the job in a single stroke. The blade was sharp, but his strength failed him a little at the last moment, and instead of coming off, the earlobe dangled by a shred of gristle. At first, there was no pain, just the warmth of blood flowing down the side of his neck. Then the pain came. It was as if a wasp, one as big as a pint bottle, had stung him and injected its poison. Luke inhaled in a long, sibilant hiss, grasped the dangling earlobe, and pulled it off like skin from a chicken drumstick. He bent over it, knowing he had gotten the damn thing, but needing to see it anyway, needing to be positive. It was there. Luke made sure he was even with the trampoline. He put his back to it, then turned a step, a medium one, he hoped, to the right. Ahead of him was the dark bulk of the northern Maine woods, stretching for God only knew how many miles. He looked up and spotted the Big Dipper with one corner star straight ahead. Keep following that, he told himself. That's all you have to do. It won't be straight on till morning either. She told Avery it's only a mile or so, and then it's on to the next step. Ignore the pain in your shoulder blades, the worst pain in your calf, and the worst pain of all in your Van Gogh ear. Ignore the way your arms and legs are trembling. Get going. But first, he drew his fisted right hand back to his shoulder and flung the scrap of flesh in which the tracker was still embedded over the fence. He heard, or imagined he heard, the small click it made as it struck the asphalt surrounding the playground's paltry excuse for a basketball court. Let them find it there. He began to walk, eyes up, and fixed on that one single star. Oh!
That's my son, and I love him like mad. That's great. I want to say a shout out too to Aaron Mackey and to my friend Paul Tremblay, who's in the audience. And if you haven't read his book, Growing Things, Head Full of Ghosts, you should.
And check out the Laura podcast. Very cool.
Well, thank you all for coming. And of course, we're all here together now and we're having a good time. And later, you'll all have to go home in the dark. Yeah, you can laugh about it now. But you know, those insurance reports say, I read this on the net, so it has to be true, that 1 in 50 of you will have forgotten. You're so goddamn excited you forgot to lock your door. I won't say that anybody could be in there, but anybody could be in your house. Upstairs. In the bathroom. Now, I want you to think tonight when you go in to the bathroom, was that shower curtain pulled? I left or not? Listen, I want to read from Joe's book, which is on sale now, and we signed a bunch of them, but you can always buy more. It's called Full Throttle. And yeah. Next week, we're going to be on the New York Times bestseller list together. How cool is that?
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to read a little bit from Joe's introduction, because that way I don't have to do any backstory, but also because it's about me. You know, when you think about it, Joe, this is really fucking conceited, but I'm going to do it anyway. We had a new monster every night. I had this book I loved, Bring on the Bad Guys. It was a big, chunky paperback collection of comic book stories. And as you might guess from the title, it wasn't much concerned with heroes. It was instead an anthology of tales about the worst of the worst, vile psychopaths with names like The Abomination and faces to match. My dad had to read that book to me every night. He didn't have a choice. It was one of those Scheherazade type deals. If he didn't read to me, I wouldn't stay in bed. I'd slip out from under my Empire Strikes Back quilt and roam the house in my Spider-Man underoos, soggy thumb in my mouth, and my filthy comfort blanket tossed over one shoulder. I could roam all night if the mood took me. My father had to keep reading until my eyes were barely open, and even then he could only escape by saying he was going to step out for a smoke and he'd be right back. My mother insists I developed childhood insomnia because of trauma. I took a snow shovel to the face at the age of 5. Actually, Joe, you were only 2. and spent a night in the hospital.
Where were you when I was proofreading this thing?
I was writing my next book, son. In that era of lava lamps, shag carpets, and smoking on airplanes, parents weren't allowed to stay overnight with their injured children in the hospital. The story goes that I awoke alone in the middle of the night and couldn't find them and tried to escape. And this part I can testify to is absolutely true. Nurses caught me wandering the halls bare-assed and put me in a crib and strapped a net down over the top to keep me in. I screamed until my voice gave out. The story is so wonderfully horrible and gothic, I think we all need to assume it's true. I only hope the crib was black and rusty and that one of the nurses whispered, "It's all for you, Damien." I loved the subhumans in Bring on the Bad Guys, demented creatures who shrieked unreasonable demands, raged when they didn't get their way, ate with their hands, and yearned to bite their enemies. Of course I loved them. I was 6. We had a lot in common. My dad read me those stories, his fingertip moving from panel to panel so my weary gaze could follow the action. If you asked me what Captain America sounded like, I could have told you. He sounded like my dad. So did the Dread Dormammu. So did Sue Richards, the Invisible Woman. She sounded like my dad, doing a girl's voice. They were all my dad, every one of them. So, thank you. I forgot. I had something else bookmarked. It's very, very short. Do I have it here? Let's see. Sugar. Wait a minute. No, that's not it. Here it is. Joe wrote a story called Late Returns that's in the book Full Throttle, which is on sale now at fine bookstores everywhere. And I just wanted to read this one paragraph. It's about a guy who runs a bookmobile, and it's a time travel story about people who get books from the future when they come in, they're late returns. The people who come in are time travelers because the bookmobile is a time machine. Says, when you consider that, well, just imagine if you lived in the 50s and liked the twists in Agatha Christie novels. Now imagine that right before you died, you had a chance to read Gone Girl. You'd die for sure of happiness. For all we know, that's what happened to the man you saw today. I can think of worse ways to go than with a good book in my hand. Okay, it's question time.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of questions from you, but I have questions of my own that I wanted to hit first now that I've got him on stage. Have any of you guys seen that show Between Two Ferns? Originally I thought I'd ride my dad, do my best Zach Gilliff, what the fuck is impression, and give him a lot of questions like, you were once on the cover of Time. What else do you have in common with Donald Trump? or
that would be fucking nothing.
But then I got thinking about it, and I guess I decided I actually didn't want to spend an hour teasing you, which is disappointing, I know. But I thought maybe there were some actual questions that I'm kind of curious about that I could that I could ask you now, in a private, intimate way, in front of 800 people. So I guess the thing.
This could be very bad because he could really go in here. He knows a lot.
I guess the first thing I'm wondering is, how much do you need to know, and what do you need to know before you start writing a novel. How many pieces did you have to have already in your head? Because I know you don't work by outline, that you don't plan ahead. What did you know that gave you the confidence to start the Institute, that told you it was ready? How much of the story did you have?
I really didn't have any of the story. I had an idea from a long time ago. I don't think that I want to say that because it's a spoiler, the stuff that happens toward the very end of the book. I had an image of, well, I'll tell you this much. I used to have this idea about a school somewhere, like a little country school that just started to move by itself. And it just started to go, and it would cut through homes and streets and trees, and the kids would be trapped inside, and it would go faster and faster. And somehow, although it has nothing to do with it, it developed into the Institute. I guess for me, I have to have a couple of different things connect. And one of the things that I was thinking about was this job that one of the characters gets. He becomes a night knocker, which is an old-fashioned job where you go around through a small town and you have a wind-up clock and you check on the businesses and you knock on doors to make sure that the doors are locked. You rattle the knobs and that sort of thing. It's a beat cop's job. One guy describes it as an analog job in a digital world.
Yeah.
So I had that, and then I started to think about the kid and the Institute, and I really wanted to write a kind of a Tom Brown School Days in Hell kind of thing. So
How many, I mean, you can sort of just make note, how many of you guys have already read The Institute? Okay, a few. So I do want to, but not everyone. So I do kind of want to be careful about spoilers. But the book does have a fascinating structure in that we have, when it begins with this guy who's getting ready to fly to New York, and the plane is too crowded, and almost on impulse, he decides to take the check that they're offering to anyone who wants to wait for tomorrow's flight. He takes it, and then instead of flying to New York the next day, he begins to hitchhike north. And ultimately almost tumbles by accident into the night knocker's job. And then we proceed to leave him for almost 400 pages.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a spoiler, but it's this sort of mesmerizing. It's like something out of Steinbeck, like, one of these Steinbeck stories about, a working class guy hitting the road, and he gets the night knocker job, and he has adventures as the night knocker job. And then suddenly he's gone and he vanishes from the story for like 300 pages. And I guess what I was wondering is, did you really write that part first?
no, I didn't. actually.
Okay.
No, I didn't. The first part of the book is called The Night Knocker. This is the book that the Institute, and the second part is called The Smart Kid.
And you started there.
I started with The Smart Kid. I started with Luke, and I changed it around later on. And I remember this thing from Edgar Rice Burroughs, where he says, I found this, and he gives all this introduction to the story, and he says, but when you read this in 5 pages, I will be forgotten. And that always stuck in my mind. And I thought, well, I'm going to tell all this stuff about Tim, but if my story's good enough, you'll forget all about him until all at once you'll say, oh my God, there he is, my old friend Tim.
Well, it also reminds me, there's two things there. It reminds me a little bit of when you read The Day of the Jackal, the very first sentence says that the jackal failed. You find out he doesn't succeed in assassinating de Gaulle, and they ruin the ending of the book. Forsyth ruins the end of the book in the first sentence. But then the book is so great, you forget that the jackal isn't going to succeed.
Yeah.
He becomes as unstoppable as the Terminator.
Well, I've always said about critics, people will say, do you read all the reviews? And I'll say, yeah, I usually do. And I feel like if all the critics are saying the same thing, you screwed up. But if they're all saying different things, you're okay. And I've read a lot of reviews that say, this is very odd structure to this book. And all I can say is it seemed like a good idea at the time. So listen, let me ask you something.
Yeah.
You've got this book of short stories. You collaborated with me on a couple of them.
Right.
And these other stories, to me, a lot of them had this feeling of Ray Bradbury and Jack Finney and some of the classic, not necessarily horror. There's horror in this book. There's some very scary things.
C.S. Lewis.
But Yeah, well,
But Fawn is obviously sort of a little bit of a riff on Narnia in a sense.
yeah, well, I thought it was also the thing they talk about that Bradbury story about the
Sound of Thunder. Yeah.
Yeah.
When they go back to hunt dinosaurs.
So my question is, who influenced you in the fantasy field? We're not talking necessarily about comic books right now, because I know that
Right.
that was a big deal with you when you.
Right.
It's always been a big deal, still is. But
Yeah.
For actually,
I mean, I talked to someone. I talked to someone about this earlier today, and and to be honest, it's very hard to sort of get around you and Mom's work. I mean, the fantasy and horror novels that shaped me were, The Talisman, It, and The Dead Zone, which were like sort of the foundational books that I read when I was 13, 14, that shaped my idea about what a good story could be.
wow, that's great. Thank you.
I did read. I mean, there was some other stuff. There was a book of short stories by Jack Finney called.
You must need a ride home.
Well, when you were talking about critics, that reminded me of the Zach Galifianakis line. You say that you're your own worst critic. Does that mean you haven't read the reviews then?
Oh, snap!
No. I read I Love Galesburg in the Springtime by Jack Finney. I had a very nice old copy of that. And that filled out some of my ideas about what a fan. I read all the Bradbury stuff because I think everyone who writes fantasy goes through a big Bradbury phase. Later, I still love him, and I'm not dissing him. I dearly love the fiction of Ray Bradbury. I think those short stories, the short stories, a lot of them you can read in as little as 10 minutes, and then you can never ever forget them. Stories like The Foghorn, where this giant prehistoric creature falls in love with a lighthouse.
Yeah, and there's something like that in
Right by the silver waters of Lake Champlain.
Full Throttle, and it's actually going to be an episode of Creepshow, TV
On Shudder,
series.
along with one of your stories is a
Yeah.
part of the Creepshow anthology. Which one is yours in the Creepshow?
The thing started, Creepshow started
Gray
a
Matter.
couple of weeks ago. Gray Matter was the first story in this season series, and your story by
Yeah,
the Silver
that's
Waters
one of the last.
is the last one.
Yeah, I figured out I
And
was.
Joe was in Creepshow, the original movie.
I was so the weird story about that is like so Dad became friends with George A. Romero, an independent filmmaker best known for Dawn of the Dead, and they were very close, and they hit on the idea of doing a film that would pay tribute to the great gross horror comics of the 1950s, Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Fear. And these comics were hugely successful. They sold millions of copies. And then in the late 50s, Congress and psychologists teamed up to make comics boring again. And they got rid of all the horror comics. But so Creepshow was gonna be that. And Dad was cast in the film as Jody Verrill.
I got to play a plant.
Yeah. He gets this stuff on him, this substance which he colorfully calls meteor shit, and then begins to turn into, begins to grow grass in his eyebrows and moss on his tongue. And I think because Dad didn't want to be lonely, he persuaded George Romero to cast me in the film as well as the little boy.
No, it was George's idea when he saw you. He thought you looked so innocent and sweet. Little did he know.
I play this kid named Billy who torments his abusive father with a voodoo doll after his father takes his horror comics away from him. So it wasn't really much of an acting stretch for me. But the thing that I remember best about it was, so my father in the film was Tom Atkins. And Tom Atkins, great, lovely man, in real life, way too affable and kind, to be hated, to be tormented with a voodoo doll. But in any event, he had to wallop me one in the film. So he fake slaps me, and then Tom Savini, the makeup artist on the film, painted a big hand-shaped bruise
Oh no!
on my face.
I know
And so
where
we
this is
shot
going.
and we shot and we shot. And back in those days, it was like 1982, so they didn't really have any like rules about how long a kid could shoot or anything or how late it was. So finally, when we left, it was like 2 a.m, and I'm like cranked up, and I began to chant, "I want a milkshake. I want a milkshake. I want a milkshake." And so my dad gave up and took me to McDonald's. And he got to McDonald's. He says, "Give the kid a chocolate milkshake." And then he's sitting there behind the wheel. And he looks,
Cigarette in one hand.
yeah. And then he looks over and then looks back, and there are 4 or 5 people in McDonald's in the drive-through window. And he suddenly realizes I still have this giant hand-shaped bruise on my face, and we're out at 2 a.m, and it looks like he's trying to bribe me off before I call Child Protection Services. So we didn't get to McDonald's again for the rest of that trip either, which was
No,
strange.
not that one anyway.
Questions, right. So you're pretty well known as a prolific writer. The Institute is actually your 203rd novel in the last 2 years. But I do know, thank you. I know that sometimes books stall, that you've had books. So, for example, you had 80 pages of Under the
Could you
Dome.
hear that? You want me to turn it up? Now go ahead.
My dad goes, "Oh, look, it's a book." So you had 80 pages of Under the Dome done and set it aside for, what, 20 years?
Longer, actually. I think.
When did you take your first whack at it?
72, and I did a whole bunch of work on it then, but there was too much research involved, and it just kind of daunted me. So I put it aside and wrote a book about vampires called Salem's Lot.
And then it's steep. I mean, it's steeped for 30 years,
Yeah.
you know, and then it was ready. There was another story about a little guy that I think you've played with off and on over the years, the little guy story. I think people feel like you must not have any self-doubts, that the things just, when do you get stuck, and how do you get unstuck?
Oh man, I have a lot of self-doubts. I think the best thing to do is when I really run into trouble, you know, the thing is, like, there's this saying, never let them see you sweat. And I think that there's someone, maybe you even will know who this is. Some famous writer said, hard writing makes for easy reading.
Yeah, that might be Elmore Leonard.
Yeah, it could have been Elmore Leonard. But the important thing is to push through, to not become depressed. And, you know, I try to remember we're all amateurs at this. And every time that I sit down, it's like the first time, I battle doubts all the time about whether or not this thing is working or that thing's working, whether or not the idea is good. The one thing that I never really doubted is the language, the ability to put the words together. But sometimes to balance things, I had the devil's own time with the Institute, because by the last quarter of the book, I felt like there were all these different balls that were up in the air at the same time, and I'm trying to make everything fit, and at the same time to make the transitions and to not make it look like it's strained.
Hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got stuck in Carrie.
I did. I got stuck in Carrie and threw it away. And my wife fished it out of the wastebasket and said that she thought it was pretty good. And my wife, Joe's mom, has this special smile that she has sometimes. And what it does is it's almost like a Picasso smile. It tilts her mouth one way, but not both. It's a very endearing smile, but I always know what it means. And when she read Carrie, and she smoothed it out, and it was covered with cigarette ashes and all this stuff. And she read it, and she said, and she had a smile on her face, and she said, you know, this is pretty good. You ought to go on with it. And I thought of something that Samuel Johnson said about dancing dogs. It's not that you you expect to see it done well. You're surprised to see it done at all. And I said, well, I don't know anything about girls' locker rooms, and they're all throwing tampons at Carrie. And I said, I don't know whether you get that from a coin op or whatever. And she said, I will help you. So she did. What's your favorite story?
I got a Tabitha King story. Tabitha
go
King
ahead,
story.
go ahead.
So my third novel is called Nosferatu, and thanks. It's about a bad man with a car that runs on human souls instead of gasoline, and I wrote a really nasty ending. And I mean, it was bleak. It was just like as bleak can get. And I decided I was going to keep it because I'm a fucking artist. And I knew my publisher was going to want me to change it. And I didn't care. I'm like, because I'm an artist. I'm going to keep it. I don't care if I sell 7 copies. That's my ending. But I would send the book to my parents first and see what they think. And my mom read it and she called me up. She said, Joe, it's just a wonderful novel, but that ending really won't do. And I said, okay, Mom. In case you wanted to know the shelf life of my artistic integrity. What do I got in here? I have a few books that I use.
Are you guys doing okay? Are you having
Yeah.
Because you know what? We can't really see you that well because of the lights in our eyes. And I always look for the telltale signs of fanny fatigue. You know, when you get there, so. All right. Okay.
Okay, so I have a few books that I use as points on the creative compass. Dead Zone is one.
Yeah.
True Grit is another. Friends of Eddie Coyle's the third.
Yep.
What about you?
Oh, man. I read an awful lot of books by a guy that's not read enough these days, Don Robertson. And he wrote a wonderful book called, it's so wonderful that I can't even remember the name of it. You know, the story about Charlie.
There's
Paradise Falls.
Paradise Falls, right?
And for a long time, I kind of, Richard Matheson was a big deal for me. We've got a story in Full Throttle that's called Throttle, and it came from a book. Some people came to Joe and to me and said, we're going to do this book of stories that riff on Richard Matheson's famous stories. One is Duel, that was a Steven Spielberg movie near the beginning of his career. And there was one called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. It was a famous Twilight Zone thing. And he's done a lot. Richard Matheson was a formative figure in my life. I Am Legend, The Shrinking Man, all those stories. So we got together. He was a big deal for me. Robert Bloch was a big deal for me. Ray Bradbury, particularly the stories. I felt that Bradbury got maybe a little tiny bit twee toward the end of his career, but the stories early on, there's one called Small Assassin, about a baby that's a killer.
Is that Matheson or Bradbury?
That's Bradbury. Small Assassin is Bradbury. And my favorite one was this kid, I think it's called The Visitor. And I got to tell you this story because this really fucked me up when I was a kid. There's this little boy named Martin who is in bed because he's got this disease. He can't get out, he's just sick. And so what he does, and Bradbury was at the peak of his abilities then to handle language, and he says that Martin had this dog, and he would say to the dog, bring me a book from the store, and he would tell him what the thing was, and he'd tell him, and the dog would go to the proprietor, and the thing would come back. The dog would come back with the book, or he would say, I really want to see Mrs. Jenkins, and she'll bring me some oatmeal cookies, and the dog would bring Mrs. Jenkins back. He'd have his teeth in the hem of her dress and bring her in and everything. So all this thing happened, and because he can't go to school, Martin has a tutor, and he falls in love with this beautiful young woman who comes to teach him reading and writing and arithmetic. And she's struck by a car and killed. And the kid is heartbroken about this. And he says to the dog, I really miss her. I really miss her. And the dog runs away. And then the dog comes back and he's covered with dirt and crumbles of clay and everything, and he hears these shuffling footsteps in the hallway. And the last line of the story is, Martin had company.
I gotta tell a quick story about Throttle and Duel, but it's really a Steve King story. We had to write that story together. It's the first story in Full Throttle. It was written to honor the Richard Matheson novella Duel, which is about an everyman on the run from a faceless trucker in a Peterbilt tanker. And Throttle is about an outlaw motorcycle gang on the run from a faceless trucker. And at the time, I didn't have my motorcycle license. I didn't know much about bikes. And I'm like, Dad had been riding bikes for 40 years. I thought, all right, we've got to do this together. He'll keep me shiny side up. He'll get the motorcycle stuff, and I won't sound like a fake. But I did get my motorcycle license not long after we wrote the story together. And a couple of years later, in the summer, we went for a ride together. He's always been a Harley guy, so he went out on his Harley, and I went out on my little Triumph Bonneville, and it was a beautiful afternoon. We got to ride together for like 30 miles, and perfect summer day. And we got back, parked the bikes. He took a look over my bike, and he said, that's a pretty nice ride, even if the engine does sound like a sewing machine. Listen,
Yeah.
we've only got so much time, and there are questions from the audience I want to take, but I have a speed round first, so let's go ahead and hit the speed round real
Shit,
quick.
I hate this.
I'm sorry. No, come on. Just go with me. It's going to be great. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's it. I've heard that all my life. Come on, Dad, it's going to be great.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Man, if I could have
I've been asking him this question since I was 4.
I guess I'd fly.
What movie have you seen the most?
Oh, Sorcerer, William Friedkin. I've seen that movie. You guys, no,
That's a
don't
good
clap because you don't know the movie, but it's fucking great. It was the follow-up to The Exorcist. Go ahead.
What's the best LP in the history of rock?
The best.
Come on, man. Speed
So
round.
many. Yeah, I know. No, all right. AC/DC, Back in Black.
Cool. What's the best single?
The best single is Sweet Soul Music by Arthur Conley.
Book you most wish you had written and didn't?
Man, fuck, there's thousands of them. I guess the book that I was most jealous of was Lord of the Rings. And I just read that and I said, this guy is so far beyond what I can do.
How many games will the Sox win next year?
The Sox next year are going to win 88 games. That's 4 more than this year, guys.
Beatles or Stones?
Stones.
Wrong. Spielberg or Kubrick?
Spielberg.
I thought so. Who's scarier, Chucky or Chuck E. Cheese?
Chuck E. Cheese. So listen.
Let's do the questions from the audience.
Yeah, let's do the questions from the audience.
Okay.
What would you say is your favorite horror movie of all time?
It, Chapter 1.
Ah, that's kind of nice.
All right, let's, nah, not that.
Now, I see that one.
Yeah.
Bullshit.
Let's see.
By the way, I want to tell you something. You might have seen a little while ago, I think back to George Bush. George Bush, the senior one, lost the election because he was in a debate and he looked at his watch at some point, and I was looking at mine, but the reason was it's this Apple Watch. And when I gave my son a hug, it says, "It looks like you've had a fall." So,
All right.
That's an app my IT guy put on the phone because obviously he decided that I'm old, doddering, and going to die soon. So it said, it looks like you've had a fall. And I had to push the little button so they wouldn't call 911. Go ahead.
What do you think happens to us when we die? Debbie wants to know.
I think that we go somewhere else. I think consciousness continues.
That might be on the other
but-
side. Might be on the
Okay,
other side. Yeah,
let's
go ahead.
see.
That's a different
You
question.
ready
Go
for
ahead.
this?
But answer the question. No, answer the question. What happens to us
no,
when we
well,
die?
I don't know, man. I think that, the thing is, like, we're all so cool. It seems like such a waste that something happens. So that's what I choose to believe. Okay, for Joe, love the firemen. Your descriptions of Portsmouth were spot on. I was born and raised in Portsmouth. Did you ever live there, or were your descriptions just great research?
I wanted to do a story that was anchored in a real place to make my outbreak of spontaneous combustion seem like a real thing. So I carefully mapped all the locations. There's a big shootout on a street at one point, and the street has some kind of ridiculous name, like Dunkirk Street. I can't remember, and I thought I must have made that up. And then I was in Portsmouth the other day and drove by it, so I guess I didn't. Stephen, in the dark, I'm reading Stephen. In the Dark Tower, you include excerpts from Stephen King's diary. Were any of these based on your actual diary?
I had a bunch of old diaries, but I didn't have any from the year in question, so they were totally made up. Okay, Joe, what is the most messed up thing your dad did to you as a child? There's so many to choose
I
from.
know, it's hard to decide. The thing is, I've thought about this a lot because there's this old Jay Leno joke, right? And goes, Stephen King asks the kids, do you want to hear a bedtime story? And the kids go, no! But the thing is it was never really like that, I mean, like we always loved bedtime stories, it was
Yeah.
the best part of the day. I always sometimes think that it's a basic misunderstanding of Dad's work to imagine that he sells fear. Politicians sell fear. I've always thought that my dad's stories sold bravery. That they essentially were making an argument that, yeah, things might get really bad, but if you have some faith and a sense of humor, and if you're loyal to your loved ones, sometimes you can kick the darkness till it bleeds daylight.
That's very nice. Very nice.
You have written several
I
books.
will say, I just want to add one thing to that. I've done a lot of interviews over the time that I've done this, and people at some point will say, what were you like as a kid? And the subtext to that question is, what fucked you up so much that you're doing this? So,
This one says, when collaborating, who gets the last word? And you have a lot of experience with collaboration in the sense of we wrote the two stories together in Full Throttle.
right?
You've written several novels with Peter Straub.
Peter Straub.
And you wrote a brilliant apocalyptic novel with Owen, with my brother Owen,
Sleeping Beauties.
called Sleeping Beauties, which came out just a couple years ago. So
And
when collaborating, who gets the last word?
we collaborate. Well, I think that with you and me, and with me and Owen and I, we rewrote each other's stuff, and we worked together so seamlessly that in the end, you couldn't tell who wrote what. I mean, obviously, there's a movie on Netflix now called In the Tall Grass, which is based. Thank you. Jesus Christ, it's like Led Zeppelin, isn't it? Stairway to Heaven. Oh, yeah. Oh, God. So, I read the story again to get ready for the movie, which is on Netflix now. You should watch it. And I couldn't tell who wrote what. I couldn't. And we even have discussed this, and I know that I have with Owen too, about who had the original idea.
Yeah, I genuinely have no idea who came up with the concept I remember where we came up with the concept.
Tell them the story about where we came up with it.
I had come down to Florida to visit Mom and Dad, and it was a late flight, and we were driving from the airport we're driving away from the airport. I said I was hungry. And so we pulled into, the Colonial House of Pancakes.
It was IHOP.
IHOP,
yeah.
yep. International House of Pancakes. And
IHOP, right. Yeah,
got a couple plates of flapjacks. And
IHOP flapjacks.
yeah. And it turned out that Dad had just finished working on something, and as it happened, I had just finished working on something, and Dad said, "Well, we should write something this week."
No, you said we should write something this week.
Okay.
You said it.
Well,
One of us said
one of us said it, and it wasn't like we had any ideas or anything. We just spitballed for about 10 minutes and came up with something.
Yeah. It turned into that story, and it was easy. And somebody asked, we did a couple of interviews for it, and somebody said, well, how do you work together? And really, I mean, here's the thing. Joe and I have a family resemblance. We look a little bit alike. We think a little bit alike. And when we write together, it's almost like Everly Brothers harmony, because the voices aren't the same, but they mix rather well. And it was that way with Owen, too.
I got a good one for you here. Have you ever been censored?
Well, in
By a
schools,
publisher.
yeah. I mean,
What about as a grown-up, though, as an adult? Have you ever been told no?
I have been. There are a couple of times when I've been about titles. I've been censored by my wife, your mother. I did a book called Dreamcatcher, and I wanted to call that book Cancer, and she said you can't call it that. You cannot call it that. Now, there are other times when she had said stuff like she said, "Oh, you can't call this book It. The critics will call it shit." And she said, "You can't call this book Misery because the critics will call it misery." And I overruled her in those cases, but she was really stern about that. But with the publishers, I had done this book that I wanted to call Unnatural Acts of Social Intercourse. And the publisher said, absolutely not. And over dinner one night, I said, well, then, if you're really firm about it, we'll call it Full Dark, No Stars, which we did. So, look, I got a question for you.
Yeah, go for it.
Who's your favorite character in any one of your novels?
I really liked writing about Harper and John, and I did this book, The Fireman, and it's an end of the world novel. It's about this pathogen that breaks out called dragon scale. You get it on you, there's no cure. And when you start to stress out, you begin to smoke. And if you can't control your fear, you burst into flames. And hospitals are burning down, neighborhoods are going up in smoke. And there's this school nurse, Harper, who is pregnant and gets the dragon scale. But because she has a medical background, she knows the dragon scale can't cross through the placental barrier. So she has a chance to deliver a healthy child. And she goes on the run. She wants to stay alive, 9 months to deliver her child. And in the course of her adventures, she becomes friends with an Englishman named John Rookwood, also known as the Fireman, who is also sick, but he is weaponized in his infection, and he's a kind of human flamethrower. And I loved writing about the two of them. I loved their banter. I loved how much they cared about other people, because I've written about a lot of nasty pieces of work, and it was nice to spend time with people who were so caring. And
yeah, that was good. That was really cool. That was cool.
Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? Dude, I just read them. Read them. I mean, I didn't come up with this shit.
I'm not going to answer that question because there are duck owners out there who would feel bad about it whichever way I answered it. So I think not. Are you ever going to let me fucking ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because we're almost.
Go ahead. Yeah, we got to be almost done. There's another one there?
Well, yeah. This one says, do you have to pay your father to be able to reference his characters and places in your works?
Do you want the money now? There's one. There's one.
Yeah, you asked me a bunch.
There's one.
Thanks. If you were trapped on looks like detergent island. If you were trapped on a deserted island, which book, movie, and food would you bring? Let's start with book.
Which book, movie, or food would you bring? I would bring How to Escape from a Desert Island in 10 Easy Lesions.
Yeah.
And food? What food would I bring?
Oh, it says this at the bottom. It says also, I have socks for you and Joe.
Have you already worn them?
All right. What food on the desert island?
What food would you? I don't know. I mean, it would get.
I get takeout pizza and then go back with the guy. See, thinking all the time, man. That's that imagination at work. Where
Here's
do you
one.
get those crazy ideas?
Here's a good one. Here's a good one. It says songs and movies get remade all the time. Why isn't this the case with novels? This question was obviously asked by someone who hasn't read The Fireman and doesn't know I was just remaking The Stand.
No, that's not true at all.
Is it? Oh, I got a question for you, and it's kind of like this question, but my question is better. So you got this. You got a book that was just a #1 New York Times bestseller, a hit movie, and enough ongoing TV shows to populate your own channel. You also only have 24 hours in a day. How do you keep yourself from being creatively spread too thin?
Well, that's actually a really good question, and it's a serious question. And the question is, when do you get to the end, and when do you stop? And is that come to a point where hopefully you and Owen and Tab, you know, my quartet, so to speak, will come to me. I say thank you. You'd come to me and say, you know, Dad, it's time for you to continue to write, but keep it to yourself. You know, but it's been a fantastic time for me, because usually when you get to be 60, 65 years old, you kind of move from the center stage to the character parts or something. And, you know, I've had a fantastic run the last 4 or 5 years, but so have you. And part of what's going on right now in this country and in the whole world is that for creative people, it's become a real seller's market. You've got Netflix, you've got Hulu, you've got the Amazon thing. The Apple Prime is doing Lisey's Story, which is going to start filming in a couple of weeks. I wrote all 8 episodes, and Julianne Moore is going to star as Lisey. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be a fantastic thing. And they're spending a bundle, and so it's been fantastic. You've got Nosferatu that's been renewed for a second season with Zachary Quinto. And believe me, this is not like the promo part of our program. I'm just saying this is amazing. Lock and Key is going to come on what? Hulu?
Netflix. It's Netflix, yeah.
So it's an amazing time for people who are creative. And I've had also the least watched, one of the best adaptations of my work was the 3 seasons of Mr. Mercedes, which is on Audience Network. And it's like we brought a stadium show to a coffee house, but that's okay. It's great and it's crazy and it's a lot of fun. So, but I think that right now, at my age, I've done a lot of work, and I can't say. I mean, every day is a new day, and you just try to continue on. I think you're probably the same way, aren't you? You know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if it's still fun and people still enjoy it, you know, then I want to keep doing it.
That's right, and that's probably a good place to stop.
Yeah, you guys were wonderful. Thanks
Yeah, you
so much
were.
for coming
Thank
out
you.
to hear us blab.